Welcome to another episode of the Storm Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is a bonus episode for Parshas Emor, being that this episode discusses the Lechem Hapanim, and the Lechem Hapanim is in this week's Parsha, Parshas Emor. This sefer is called Meir Panim, and the second edition has just been published in Eretz Yisrael. So there'll be a link in the show's notes that you can order the sefer. Hopefully you can order it to America. I'm not exactly sure, but I'll put that information in the show's notes. I'll also link to the website. That's the Showbread Institute. And you can check out all their information. They have a YouTube channel, and you can check everything out in the show's notes. If anyone would like to sponsor an episode of the podcast, and podcast is still continuing with the 10 Lost Tribes series. I also have a forthcoming episode on Lag BaOmer. This year, there'll be an episode on searching for Sinai, where Har Sinai is. That'll be for Shavuos, Mirza Hashem. There are some other episodes, obviously, when we get to 3 weeks and other things related, more seasonal items then, but there also are assorted episodes. Also working on 1 or 2 series perhaps, and definitely working on a mini-series, a biography. If you're interested in sponsoring that, you can reach out, email me, sfarmchat@gmail.com, or see the information in the show's notes below, or if you want to just support the podcast, all the information is in the show's notes. You can find links in the show's notes too. You can subscribe to the Sfarm Chatter Substack, as well as the Sfarm Chatter YouTube channel, and the Sfarm Chatter WhatsApp group, where it's an admin-only chat where I post new books, Sfarm book deals. Actually, this episode is being released. Amazon is running a big book deal. I don't know what the deals will be yet when I'm recording this, but anything that comes up, I post there. Some on Twitter, X, but a lot over there as well. And of course, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. So with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Eliezer Saidel, who is the mechaber of the new sefer Meir Panim on Lechem Hapanim, and he's in charge of Machon Lechem Hapanim. And we'll be discussing Lechem Hapanim. The sefer Meir Panim goes through Lechem Hapanim from A to Z, everything about Lechem Hapanim that you ever knew or didn't know or want to know. So thank you, Rabbi Saidel, for joining me.
Yeshakov.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I'm South African by birth. I was born in Johannesburg, South Africa in 1965. I only discovered the kesher between my bar mitzvah parsha and the Lechem Hapanim, that it was kanireh basher, that my bar mitzvah parsha was tzav, that deals with all the menachos. And when I gave my bar mitzvah drasha, it had nothing to do with the menachos. It had to do with other stuff. And only later in life did I realize there was a kesher between the two. So kanireh that's bashert. I lived in South Africa till the age of 21, and I came to Israel at the age of 21 on Aliyah. I currently live in Karnei Shomron, which is just outside Kfar Saba near Ra'anana. I live with my family, my wife and 4 children, and I'm a baker by profession since the last 15 years. Before the last 15 years, I was a computer programmer. And I decided to have a change in midlife and become a baker.
So were you always into baking as a youth, or there's something you just went from computer programming to baking?
So actually, the baking preceded the computer programming. My mother was a caterer back in South Africa. She did catering. So from a very young age, I was exposed to the food business. But when I finished school, instead of going for the love of baking, which already began when I was bar mitzvah, I decided to go for the money, which was in computers and not in the baking. So that's the way my life mitgalgeld till the age of 45, when my neshama gave me a little bit of a wake-up call and says that just not your calling. Your calling is baking.
So by baking, you have like a bakery? What do you mean? What does it mean?
So we have a bakery. We have a little small artisan bakery in the back of our home, actually. We converted the back of our house into a small little boutique bakery where we make breads specifically connected to Jewish history, Jewish-style breads. Not every denomination of bread from France and Italy, just specifically Jewish breads. The name of our business is called the Jewish Baking Center. I've done a lot of research into the history of the different breads throughout Jewish history. And that's what we concentrate on. We make challahs, we make bagels, we make bialis from bialy stock, we make Jewish rye, we make all different things which have a Jewish connection. That's special.
And so the bakery is just open to the public?
Yep. We have a local store here in Karnei Shomron where we sell locally. And we also deliver we're a Friday business. We deliver every Friday to the major centers in the center of the country, like Jerusalem, Modi'in, Beit Shemesh, Ra'anana. We have drivers delivery.
So how did you get interested in Lechem Hapanim? I guess, like you said, Prince of Parsha, and then you're a baker. But what's this connection to Lechem Hapanim?
So one day I was busy selling challahs in my bakery on Erev Shabbos. And one of my neighbors, he's a Rav, his name is Steve Weisberg, Rav Steve Weisberg. He studied in Yeshiva University. He came into the store to buy challahs one Shabbat, one Friday. And he showed me this book. He says, have you ever seen this book before? And he shows me this book. It's called Chameshet Minei Dagan. It was a book written by a professor for Bar Ilan University. His name is Professor Zohar Amar. Don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's the Dean of Land of Israel, studies in archaeology in Bar Ilan University. He wrote a very interesting sefer trying to botanically identify the 5 species of grain that you make Birkat HaMotzi on. So I started reading this book. It was very interesting for me as a baker. It was baking related. I started reading it. And at the end of the book, there was a chapter about the Lechem Hapanim. And when I started reading this, I realized how little I knew about the Lechem Hapanim. I thought I knew a little bit about it, the miracle that it remained fresh and Beis Garmu, etc., etc. But when I started reading this chapter, I realized I knew very, very little about it. And I started exploring a little bit more. And it totally hooked me. There was something a little bit more deep in the whole thing. It got me completely hooked. And I started reading up more about it. And I contacted Professor Amar, actually, from Bar Ilan. And I told him that I was a baker. And I said, maybe you'd be interested in me collaborating with you, trying to improve the result. He'd been doing experimentation, trying to reproduce the Lechem Hapanim, actually baking it. And he didn't get very far. So I offered to help him to try improve the techniques of trying to bake it. So that's how I got interested in the first place. And the initial collaboration with him was more technical than anything else. It was giving my baking expertise, trying to figure out the ingredients to use in what ratio, what baking utensils, what temperatures of the oven, etc., etc. But slowly but surely it developed into something a lot more deeper, which led to a lot more discovering the essence of the Lechem Hapanim, including the shape of the Lechem Hapanim, the secret of Beit Garmu, which relates to the thickness of the Lechem Hapanim, which is a tefach, which is a big mystery how they actually got to the thickness of a tefach. So all these things came later. It came from beginning with all the technicalities, and then it developed into something which was much more fundamental and much more pnimi on the Lechem Hapanim.
And I guess that led you to write a whole sefer, an entire sefer. The sefer is, she mentioned, about over 200 pages on Lechem Hapanim.
So to my knowledge, I think it's the first sefer dedicated specifically to the subject. You have a lot of the Sfarim that deal with the Lechem Hapanim in a brief way, but no sefer, to my knowledge, is actually dedicated specifically until now to that subject. Maybe when Beit Garmu were alive, maybe there was something. But since Beit Garmu, I don't think so.
So let's start off here for the listeners. Let's give most listeners probably familiar at least a little bit with Lechem Hapanim from Chumash, but let's give an overview of Lechem Hapanim, the Shulchan, and then you mentioned Beis Garmu a bunch of times. Gemara and Yuma, talk about that. Let's give an overview before we dive in a little further. You go pretty in depth in the sefer.
Okay, so the Lechem Hapanim was basically a secret weapon. That's basically what it was. It was a majorly powerful weapon that through the Lechem Hapanim, all the Shefa HaElyon from heaven was channeled through the Lechem Hapanim to the Olam HaGashmi. Which means that as long as there was Lechem Hapanim, there was Shefa in the world. If there was no Lechem Hapanim on the Shulchan, then that was interrupted, it stopped. The reality that we're living today in the modern age and the modern society is not even a faint shadow of the reality of the Shefa that existed in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. And this was all because of the Lechem Hapanim. The Lechem Hapanim was the gateway. It was the kind of a conduit between Olam HaElyon and Olam HaGashmi. The Lechem Hapanim was actually 12 loaves of bread that were switched every Shabbat on the Shulchan. They would switch the previous week's bread with a new set of 12 loaves, 2 stacks of 6 bread, one alongside each other, and they were on the Shulchan the entire week. In between the 2 stacks of bread, there were 2 little bowls, 2 little bazichim of levona, which is one of the ingredients of the Ketoret. And as long as the Lechem Hapanim was on the Shulchan, there was shefay throughout the world. First of all, to Am Yisrael, and from Am Yisrael to the rest of the world. On Friday, they used to bake a new set of Lechem Hapanim and used 12 loaves of Lechem Hapanim. In the second Beit Sheni, it was baked by the family called Beit Garmu. Before that, it was also baked by Leviim. Beit Garmu, or a family of Leviim from the family of Kehat. All the way from the Mishkan, it belonged. The job belonged to the family of Kehat. They were entrusted with schlepping the shulchan through the midbar and also baking the bread. So the Lechem Hapanim, unless it was the Erev Chag on Erev Shabbos, in which case it was baked on Erev Chag, but most cases it was normally baked on Fridays, the Lechem Hapanim, a new set of 12. On Erev Shabbos, the Kohanim used to go inside the Hechal. They would dismantle the snipim, which were the side supports for the Lechem Hapanim on the side. They would also dismantle the pipes, the kanim, the menakiot, they're called in the pasuk, from underneath the Lechem Hapanim, so that on Friday night, the 12 breads remain on the table supported by their own weight without all the accessories that were there to support the breads throughout the rest of the week. And that would be on Friday night. On the following day, on Shabbos day, they would switch the breads on the Shulchan. A Kohen would come in carrying a stack of 6 breads, and he would stand on the northern side of the Shulchan while a Kohen from the outgoing shift, Shabbos was also when they changed the shifts of the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash. So a Kohen from the incoming shift would stand on the northern side with a new stack of breads, while the Kohen from the outgoing shift would stand on the southern side. And while he was sliding the new stack of breads onto the Shulchan, the other Kohen was sliding the previous week's bread off. And they were slid on and off simultaneously in order to Mekayem the pasuk which says Lechem Panim Lefanai Tamid. It had to be perpetually on the Shulchan. There was not allowed to be even a very brief time that there was no bread on the Shulchan, because it was a bracha for parnasa for the whole world. It was not allowed to be interrupted. They would switch the 2 stacks of Lechem Hapanim with a new set of 2 stacks of bread. They would also switch the 2 bowls of levona in the center of the table with a new set of levona. The previous week's levona was then removed from the Hechal. It was taken outside to the Mizbeach HaOlah, where it was burnt on the Mizbeach. And from the time the levona was burnt, the Kohanim were then allowed to eat the Lechem Hapanim that had been removed from the previous week. The 2 shifts of Kohanim would share the 12 loaves of bread. In Bais Sheni, there was approximately 250 Kohanim per shift. So you're talking about 500 Kohanim sharing these 12 loaves of bread. It's a lot of people sharing, although they're very enormous breads, still a lot of people. It ended up that each Kohen only got a kazait of the Lechem Hapanim. But one of the nisim of the Lechem Hapanim was that even though it was a small kazait, he ate the kazait and it filled him up as if he'd eaten an entire meal. And that is how the Lechem Hapanim was changed every Shabbat. The Lechem Hapanim rested on the Shulchan the entire week from one Shabbat to the next Shabbat. And one of the main miracles of the Lechem Hapanim is that when it was removed a week later, it was as fresh, and some Mefarshim said it was even warm, as if it had just come out of the oven. That is the basic technicalities of the Lechem Hapanim and the procedural things, how it actually took place.
And in the Sefer, and we can discuss a little more, you kind of dive into that further, into the baking and the kneading and the shape and the corners, and we talk about the shulchan as well. You talk about you said the thickness, etc. I mean, there's a lot there that we can the switching out, as you already discussed. I mean, that's the overview. We can talk about that as well. And of course, you talk about, like you mentioned, the pnimius, the actual, not just the physical, also the kind of the ruchnius, the behind of the Lechem Hapanim. So one more overview kind of thing, which kind of comes up here, is Beis Garmu. You mentioned them a bunch of times. this family and what their importance and their secret. Explain their story and their connection to Lechem Hapanim.
Okay, so you have the Beis Hamikdash Hasheni is drawing to an end. It's just before the Churban. And the Chachamim know that there's going to be a Churban. They know what the situation is in the Israeli society. And they know that the Churban is imminent. And they don't want all these secret procedures that are in the Beis Hamikdash to be lost. And there are a number of them. The one is the Lechem Hapanim. The other one is the Ketoret. There's a family who makes the Ketoret. They have a secret technique how they make the Ketoret. There's a choir master of the Leviim choir, Ugras ben Levi, who has very interesting techniques for doing Shira of the Leviim. Some say it's very similar to beatboxing with his tongue and his thumb in his mouth. And there was also a sofer called Ben Kamtsar. Those are the four listed in the Mishnah in Maseches Yoma, that the Chachamim approached them to try get them to reveal the secret technique that they've been using to do their tafkid in the Beis Hamikdash. They were each in charge of one of the major tafkidim in the Beis Hamikdash. Beis Garmu in charge of the Lechem Hapanim. Beis Avtinas was in charge of the Ketoret. Ugras ben Levi was in charge of the Levim choir. And Ben Kamtsar was the sofer who wrote all the Megillas and all the Sifrei Torah in the Beis Hamikdash. So they approached Beis Garmu and they said, okay, we'd like to record the technique, how you make the Lechem Hapanim, so that when the Beis Hamikdash is chas v'chalila destroyed, so that the secret of the Lechem Hapanim will not be lost. And as we know from the story in Masechet Yoma in the Gemara, that Beis Garmu refused to reveal the secret. So the Chachamim didn't understand why they were refusing. They didn't accept their refusal. And that's why they're listed in a group of people that says lignai, which means in a negative context, because they considered a negative thing that they didn't cooperate with the Chachamim. And they got so angry with Beis Garmu and all these other people that they actually fired them. They fired the whole lot of Beis Garmu. They sent them home. And they went to Egypt, to Alexandria, to find bakers, expert bakers from Egypt who could replace Beis Garmu in baking the Lechem Hapanim. And the Gemara goes on to tell the story how the Egyptian bakers were the very most famous bakers in the world at the time, but even though they had very good expertise in baking, they never managed to perfect the Lechem Hapanim. When they took it out of the oven, it fell apart. It didn't keep its shape. When it was on the shulchan for 2 days, it went moldy. They just couldn't get it right. So the Chachamim now had a serious dilemma because they'd fired Beis Garmu. They never found anyone who was suitable to replace them. And they never had anybody to make the Lechem Hapanim. So they had no choice but to go back to Beis Garmu and plead with them to come back to work in the tafkid, which Beis Garmu agreed to only when they doubled their salary. So the whole Maisa seemed like a kind of an extortion almost, that the Beis Garmu were extorting the Chachamim to double their salary. That's how it appears on the surface. But obviously there's a lot more behind the scenes that are not apparent in the Pshat of the Gemara. So the most important thing to understand is that there's a Mishnah in Masechet Avot which lists 10 nisim that happened in the Beis Hamikdash. And one of the nisim was that there was never ever a psul ever found in the Omer, the Shtei HaLechem and HaLechem Hapanim. In all the time that the Beis Hamikdash existed, which is over 800 and something years, every time they made the Lechem Hapanim, there was never ever a fault in the Lechem Hapanim. Now, as a baker, I can tell you from my personal experience baking bread that is unprecedented. You can maybe bake bread perfectly for 3 weeks in a row, but somewhere along the line, something's going to go wrong. For it to be without a psul for over 800 years, every single week, non-stop, that is obviously something that's miraculous and not a natural phenomenon. So obviously, Beis Garmu had a lot of siyata d'ishmaya, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. Beis Garmu, the continuation of the Gemara tells how they were very big in the inyan of maris ayin. They didn't want anybody to suspect them of foul play, that they were using the soles from the Beis Hamikdash to make their own personal bread. They would only bake with dark flour, not with light flour, that it wouldn't appear that they were using the soil from the Beis Hamikdash. They were actually big tzaddikim. And the reason they give in the Gemara that they didn't want to reveal the secret is because, as I said in the beginning, the Lechem Hapanim was a super powerful weapon. It was the tool that controlled the global economy, basically. If you think of today, there were a group of people who could, by turning off a switch, turn every stock exchange in the world off in an instant. That's what power Beit Garmo had, basically. And they didn't want this power to fall into the wrong hands that would be used for the wrong purposes. And for that reason, they didn't reveal it even to the Chachamim. They didn't feel that it would serve any purpose during the 2,000 years of Am Yisrael being in Galus, knowing the secret, as opposed to the Ketores, for example, which did serve a purpose in Galus, because the Ketores is also a remedy for a plague. If there's a Magefa, then they take tzaddikim and they go to the Shara and they say Pitum HaKetoret, and it stops a plague. So there was a purpose for the Beit Avtinas to tell the story that served Am Yisrael in Galus, but for Beit Garmu, they didn't perceive that there was any reason that they should reveal the secret in the years in Galut. It didn't serve Am Yisrael any purpose.
Okay, so that's the story of Beis Garmu. Like you said, they're in the Mishnah of Lignai at the end of the day, right?
Yeah. But at the end, there's the maskana of the Gemara. As I said, Al Rishonim Amru Zechet Tzadik Livracha, Al Achronim Amru B'Shem Reshaim Yerkav. So there's a machlokes, who's the Rishonim and who's the Achronim. According to some of the opinions that the Rishonim are Beit Garmu, Beit Avtinas, and Ugras ben Levi, the Gemara concluded that they were actually tzaddikim, Zechet Tzadik Livracha, and only the last one, Ugras ben Levi, he was the B'Shem Reshaim Yerkav. So there's a machlokes in the Gemara exactly how the whole story ended.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more now. We got the whole overview of the Lechem Hapanim, and you can, obviously, we're not going to go through the Sefer. The Sefer is very in-depth, and we can be here for many hours. And as I understand it, I think you give presentations, and we can talk about that later for listeners who want to see more, especially with visual. This is only audio, so we're going to discuss a little the shape, and it's hard to see. The Sefer has pictures, diagrams, and many things, and I'm sure in your presentations there's a lot of that included as well. So this is only audio, so this is just kind of a taste, so to speak, not the actual thing. But there's what to talk about. Obviously, you can start the mixing together, the baking, the shape, of course, is a big deal. I mean, everyone, I think that's what listeners, probably the layman is probably familiar with the shape. Rashi talks about, everyone, talks about the shape. So I don't know where you want to start, the baking, the shape, the ingredients, I don't know, and then there's also, like you say, the pnimi, the davar ruchni, we can talk about as well a little later of the Lechem Hapanim. So I'll let you pick where you want to start over here.
Okay, I think we'll start with the shape, because Dafka, the shape was like a kind of a crossroads for me with the Lechem Hapanim. So let's start with that maybe. So if you look in the Gemara in Masechet Menachot on Daf Tzadi Daled Amud Bet, there's a machloket. What was the shape of the Lechem Hapanim? One opinion of Rabbi Chanina says that it was a teva prutza, which means it's a kind of a box with no lid on top of the box. And the second opinion of Rabbi Yochanan says that it was a sfina rokedet, which means a ship that dances in the waves. The language of the Gemara is very cryptic. It doesn't really describe what the Lechem Hapanim looked like. And in order to understand what the Lechem Hapanim looked like, you have to get a little bit of help from Rashi. And Rashi on the side puts little diagrams where he draws a picture of the Teva Putza and he draws a picture of the Sfina Rokedet. And the pictures that I originally looked at when I began my collaboration with Professor Amar were the pictures from the Vilna Shas, which is the most accepted version of the Gemarot today. Most people, when they study Gemara, they use the one of the versions of the Vilna Shas. So the Teva Putza is pretty intuitive. It's a box without a lid. Not much room left for doubt with that one. The problem was not with the Teva Putza. The problem was with the Sfina Rokedet, because the picture that Rashi gives in his Perush is the picture of the letter that looks like a letter V, the English letter V. If you look at the verbal Perush in the Gemara, they say that the bread was folded. That was folded on both sides. There's different opinions, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, how much they folded it. One was 2 tfachim, one was 2.5 tfachim. But basically, the bread was folded 2 tfachim or 2.5 tfachim on either side. In other words, the V shape doesn't correspond to what the Gemara actually says, because if you look at a V shape, it has 2 sides which are 5 tfachim each side. So that already lit a red light for me that it was something not 100% correct here. So I contacted Professor Amar regarding this question, and I said to him, there's a stira between the picture of Rashi and the text of the Gemara, because it says 2.5 tfachim, and these flanks of the bread are 5 tfachim. It's not 2.5 tfachim. How do you reconcile that? So he said, you know what, maybe the drawing in the Vilna Shas may not be accurate, which was a little bit of a chidush for me, because I just took Vilna Shas's Torah and Moshe Misinai, and I didn't question the Vilna Shas. So he suggested to me that I go and look for manuscripts of Perush Rashi on Masechet Menachot, which predated the Vilna Shas, and see what kind of pictures appeared for the Sfina Rokedet and the Teva Purza in these older manuscripts. So that began a little bit of a voyage of discovery. I first started off in the National Israel Library, the Sifriya Halaumit in Yerushalayim. They have a very huge repository of almost every Judaica document existing in the world, or at least copies of them, or digitized copies of them, or at least they have cataloged where the originals are stored in which libraries around the world. And I searched for the oldest existing Perush Rashi on Masechet Menachot that was still in existence today. And the oldest one was from the 1300s in the Vatican archives in Rome. So I contacted the curator of the Vatican archives, and I asked him if I could possibly view the manuscript, if there was some way that I could view the manuscript. I was expecting them to send me a papal jet to fly me to Rome to go and see the Da Vinci Code. I don't know if you read the book, the Da Vinci Code. But obviously things don't work that way in real life. In real life, it's not as romantic as Tom Hanks. So the way he responded is he sent me a link to this manuscript, which is digitized and was available for viewing on the internet, which is quite remarkable. So I started paging through the manuscript of Rashi on Masechet Menachot from 1300, and it's quite a experience paging through Rashi, as opposed to the modern Gemarot, where you have the Gemara in the middle and Rashi on the left-hand side and the Tosfot on the right-hand side. This was just pure Rashi without any Gemara. It was just plain Rashi with nothing to give any context. So you had to page through to the appropriate place where the drawings were. It was not so easy to do, but eventually I got to Daf Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph, and I was just about to turn the page to Daf Tzadi Daled Amud Bet, where the drawings were, and there was no Daf Tzadi Daled Amud Bet. The document was only preserved until Daf Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph. The following page no longer existed, obviously got lost. There was a flood or something, and the pages were damaged after that. Obviously, nothing is by chance. Everything is basher. There was a reason for it, Kanir. Nobody wanted the people in the Vatican to know maybe what the Lechem Hapanim really looked like. So the page didn't exist. So I couldn't find the pictures from 1300. I had to skip forward in time to the next manuscript, which is from the 1500s in the Library of St. Petersburg in Russia. It was a manuscript, handwritten manuscript written by the Talmidim of Rashi, not by Rashi himself. And there the picture of the Teva Purza was identical to the Vilna Shas, but the picture of the Sfina Rokedet was a completely different picture. It looked like a kind of a boat, and the picture appears in the Sefer. And Rashi, in his verbal Perush, he also adds a word in ancient French, which is kuv vav vav yud tet, which is a word in ancient French for a kind of a boat. And I contacted a linguistics professor from the University of Provence in France to try to figure out what kind of boat Rashi was referring to. And he sent me a picture of this boat, and it also appears in the Sefer. And it looks nothing like the shape of a V, which is the most important thing of this whole exercise with it, was to prove what the actual shape of the Sfina Rokedet was. And it didn't look like a V. In fact, it looked like the letter U and not like the letter V. And I explain in the Sefer how it got to the stage where the Vilna Shas drew it as the letter V, because they didn't have the same resources that we have today. Today we have a lot more resources, both in terms of libraries from around the world, which are all interconnected with each other. We don't have the archaeological evidence that they didn't have back in 1800s, the archaeological evidence that we have today of ancient coins from the time of Bais Sheni showing the picture of the Lechem Hapanim. So their mistake was a very innocent mistake. It was based on trying to interpret the verbal Perush of Rashi the way they understood it. And if you just base yourself on the verbal explanation, it could very well be a V. But unless you have the additional cues from all the other pieces of evidence from the manuscripts and from the archaeology, there's no indication to give you any reason to believe that it didn't look like a V. As soon as I found that the Lechem Hapanim looked like a U and not like a V, I started trying to bake the Lechem Hapanim in the shape of a U instead of a V. Until then, I'd been baking it in a special pan that we had constructed, which looked like the letter V. So we had new pans constructed, which looked like the letter U. And I started baking the Lechem Hapanim in the shape of the U. And we put them on the shulchan together with the levona. And one day I was just passing by this display of the Lechem Hapanim with the bazichim on the shulchan. And looking at it at a certain angle, it reminded me of a smiling face. And that was like a eureka moment for me. And it's not intuitive that you would understand that the Lechem Hapanim looks like a smiling face if you think that the shape of the Lechem Hapanim is a V, because it doesn't look like a smiling face if the shape is a V. But when you see it in the shape of a U, then you understand that it resembles a smiling face. And then you understand the whole concept of one of the main Musarei Askel of the Lechem Hapanim is Ezehu Ashir Samech Bechelko, because there's an intricate connection between Simcha and Parnosa. The fact that it was a smiling face. On the Shloshet HaRegalim, the Kohanim used to bring out the kelim from the Hechal to show all of Am Yisrael. They showed them that it remained fresh, and that Am Yisrael could see what the Lechem Hapanim could look like, and immediately they drew the conclusion themselves what the Musar Haskel was of the Lechem Hapanim. So that was a watershed moment for me when I discovered that the shape was the shape of the U. And basically from then onwards, it was a reverse engineering exercise trying to bake the Lechem Hapanim in that shape, with the parameters given in all other sources that had to be a tefach thick according to Masechet Pesachim, according to Gemara in Masechet Pesachim, it has to be a tefach thick, it has to look like the shape of the U, etc., etc. So we have to try reverse engineer the Lechem Hapanim to get to those parameters. And that was a simple exercise of applying cereal chemistry and my knowledge of baking, trying to figure out how to do that. And although the secret of the Beis Garmu didn't survive the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, but the science of baking continued after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. People continued to bake bread. The art of baking bread evolved, and it accumulated more and more knowledge. So that at least was not lost. And using the knowledge of baking science, we are able to reverse engineer the Lechem Hapanim and get it to the parameters that are mentioned in the Gemara and in the Mishnah. The only problem was the thickness. The thickness was the stumbling block, because when you take the dough of the Lechem Hapanim according to the ingredients that are listed in the pasuk, the thickness of the dough is only 1 finger thick. But the thickness of the bread when it's baked at the end has to be a tefach, it has to be 4 fingers thick. In other words, the Lechem Hapanim has to rise up from 1 finger to 4 fingers. So you have to get the bread to rise without making it chametz, because the Lechem Hapanim is a matzah. So to get something to rise without becoming chametz, that is a very neat trick. And the problem is not really the baking application of how to do it. There's a number of ways to do it. The issue, the sugya is more of a halachic sugya, how to do it without being over the isur of chametz. And that was another study all on its own. I collaborated with a Rav called Harav Shabtai Rappaport. He's a big mumche on the subject of chametz. And we try to figure out a way to do this and keep the bread matzah halachically without making it chametz. And that is the appendix right at the end of the book, which describes that whole adventure. It was quite an adventure.
So there's a lot of fascinating things here, and first of all, the tzuras, the shape of the Lechem Hapanim. You go quite in depth with many pictures and diagrams, and you explain all you said, the different manuscripts of Rashi and the old Prince editions of Gemara. So you go through. It's a very fascinating chapter to read, and it's also in Lumdus just to actually go through, and then the history of Rashi and how you understand based on a picture how you understand the sugya in Menachos. So that's very interesting. Also, there's one more thing about the shape, which is you also talk about the karnas Lechem Hapanim, right? The corners. So how does that play into the shape of the Lechem Hapanim?
Okay, so the kranot of the Lechem Hapanim, if you look at most of the literature that talks about the Lechem Hapanim, first of all, you will not see the shape of the Sfina Rokeret, you'll see the shape of the Teva Prutza. And the reason for that is because in Hilchas Tmidim and Musafim of the Rambam, where he talks about the Lechem Hapanim, he says that the Lechem Hapanim is merubaat, which means that it's square. In other words, it seems as if the Rambam was posek that the Lechem Hapanim was square. In other words, most people interpret that he was posek according to the Teva Prutza, not according to the Sfina Rokeret. And that is why most of the literature today goes according to that theory that the Rambam was posek according to the Teva Prutza. However, already in the Rambam, you have the commentator on the Rambam, the Kesef Mishnah, already asks a question on that. He says, how can the Rambam be posek that the Lechem Hapanim was a Teva Prutza if the maskana of the Gemara was opposite? The maskana of the Gemara was that it was a Sfina Rokeret. So the Rambam seems to be contradicting the maskana of the Gemara. And he leaves the question with a tzarich iyun. He doesn't have an answer how the Rambam was posek according to the Teva Prutza. Maybe he offers an opinion, maybe that he deferred to Rabbi Chanina because Rabbi Chanina was more senior than Rabbi Yochanan, so maybe he deferred to his opinion. That was one of the opinions. In the Sefer, I give another option of understanding the Rambam, and that is that the Rambam was actually not posek, not according to the one shita nor the other shita. In fact, in the halacha of the Rambam, when he says that the lechem was merubat, what he was referring to was the beginning shape of the bread before it was folded. The bread begins as a rectangle, of 10 tvachim by 5 tvachim wide. And after it is already shaped in that rectangle, then you fold the sides either into the shape of the Teva Prutza or into the shape of the Sfina Rokeret. So the Rambam was talking about merubat in the ratio of his psak. According to my theory, is that he was talking to the bread before it was folded. The fact that he was referring to it as merubat is undisputed, that it began off as a rectangular shaped bread before it was folded. The question is what it looked like after it was folded. And one of the main mafarshim on the Rambam, the Ri Kurkus, also completely ignores the sugya between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina. He doesn't talk about the terms that they use, doesn't talk about the teva, doesn't talk about the Sfina Rokeret. So it seems to indicate that the Rambam was posek halacha, the ikar hadin of the Lechem Hapanim, the basic minimum requirements that are required to make the Lechem Hapanim what it is. And the folding patterns are not necessarily machayer al pi halacha. There are just different patterns that they use, different minhagim that they use to fold the Lechem Hapanim. And in fact, that is the shita of the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish says that the different shapes, according to Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yochanan, were simply minhagim. Now we get to the question that you asked about the kranot. So the kranot, if you look at the pictures in the literature, you'll see that the kranot of the Teva Prutza radiate inwards towards the opposite keren in the middle of the bread. And that is a very nice configuration when you look at it in a picture. But when you actually bake the bread in that configuration and you put the bread on the shulchan and you leave it for 3 or 4 days, what happens is the kranot that are radiating inwards begin to sag down like this. In other words, they don't retain their shape. And one of the nisim of the Lechem Hapanim is that when it was removed from the shulchan, it was identical to the way it was placed on the shulchan. So if the bread is now changed shape or it's bent out of shape, then the bread is pasul. So you're not allowed to have the kranot bending down. Now, the Lechem Hapanim has all kinds of accessories on the shulchan which have a purpose of keeping the shape of the Lechem Hapanim. You have the ksavot or the snipim, which are alongside on the outside to prevent it from bending outwards. you have the kanim, you have the menakiyot under the bread to prevent it from folding in on itself and becoming moldy. So you have a lot of hishtadlus on the shulchan of active intervention to try keep the shape and to try keep the bread fresh as much as possible. And nowhere do we see any component of the shulchan to support the kranot like they appear in most of the literature, which radiate inwards. So that brought me to the conclusion that perhaps the kranot as they appear in these drawings may not be the correct shape of the kranot. And then you get to the opinion of the Ralbag. The Ralbag comes up with a very interesting approach. He said instead of the kranot radiating away from the tfanot of the upright flanks of the side of the bread, they are actually integral part of the tfanot. In the shape of the Ralbag, he actually cuts out diagonal corners on the tfanot of the bread, and according to the Ralbag, those were the kranot. However, that doesn't really gel with the Perush Rashi. If you look at Perush Rashi, Rashi says they are part of the tfanot, but they are protrusions protruding out of the tfanot. So I came up with another configuration which I proposed in the chapter on the kranot that matches the Perush of Rashi, and it also matches the Perush of the Ralbag, that the kranot were part of the actual dofen and not pieces radiating inwards. The idea of the radiating inwards, the source of that opinion is from the Tashbetz. The Tashbetz, one of the Rishonim, he proposed that configuration that they radiate inwards, because from the Pshat of the Gemara, it says kayef legave, which means that they were folded inwards. The question is, inwards in which direction? Were they folded inwards to the middle of the bread, or were they folded inwards to the middle of the dofen? That is the question. According to the Tashbetz, they were folded inwards towards the middle of the bread, but that doesn't stand with the reality that the kranot fall down when you leave them unsupported. So the question is there's a tzarich iyun on the Tashbetz, how he had that opinion that the kranot actually pointed inwards and not alongside the dofen, parallel to the dofen.
So that's, like I said, another entire chapter. Now, I think we should also talk about, there's a lot more to talk about the baking, and we'll talk about your practical, you mentioned it already, we talk about your you have as an appendices in the Spachim, where you mentioned your actual kind of experiments with this. We can talk about that as well. But before that, I think there's also we should also talk about the shulchan. You already mentioned the bread went on the shulchan, Lechem Hapanim, the way it was switched. You have a chapter on discussing how it came off, how that was put on the shulchan, and I think you start off the sefer explaining. You can talk about this also, how the shulchan is mentioned first in Chumash, as in Shemayis, and then Lechem Hapanim only comes in Vayikra. So, but then if you want to talk about that a little bit, how that kind of and the shulchan and the importance of the shulchan to the Lechem Hapanim.
Okay, so the Zohar Kadosh says, he asks the question, what was the ikar? Was the shulchan the ikar, or the Lechem Hapanim was the ikar? And the Zohar comes to the conclusion that the ikar was the shulchan and not the Lechem Hapanim. He compares the shulchan to a tree and the Lechem Hapanim to the fruit of a tree. He says, unless you have a tree, you can't have the fruit. And he says that the shulchan was the ikar and the Lechem Hapanim was the fruit of the tree. And we certainly see that in the psukim, that the first mention of the Lechem Hapanim starts off with the shulchan, and then it goes on to the Lechem Hapanim after that. So the question is why I began the book Dafka talking about the Lechem Hapanim and not the shulchan. And the answer is because there are a lot of machlokot in the Gemara regarding the different parts of the shulchan, what they look like, and how exactly they fit together. And there's a lot of machlokot that don't have a conclusion. And in order to resolve these machlokot, the only way to do that is to understand what the bread looked like. If you don't understand what the bread looked like, then you'll never understand what the shulchan looked like. Unfortunately, we don't have the shulchan because it was nignaz, or it was taken into Rome when they destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash, but we don't have a good picture of it, except for the Arch of Titus, which is a very rough sketch of the shulchan. So we don't really have any way to know from archaeological evidence what the shulchan looked like. But again, as I said, the art of baking was not lost to history, continued after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So we have a very good possibility to reproduce the bread and reverse engineer the bread to get it look what it looked like in the time of Bais Sheni. And based on the bread, you can then understand the structure of the shulchan. If you understand that the bread was shaped like a U and not like a V, that has direct ramifications, for example, on the snipin, which were the side supports, what they looked like, whether they were curved or whether they were radiating at an angle like they depicted in the Vilna Shas. So there are a lot of machlokot like this that have no resolution, that unless you understand the bread, you cannot understand the shulchan. And that is the reason I began with the discussion of the bread, not because the bread is chas v'chalila more important than the shulchan. Ha'efech. The shulchan is the ikar and the bread is the tafel. But in order to understand the structure of the shulchan, you first have to have a basis. You need a foundation, and the foundation is the bread. I took a Musar Haskel from Bezalel when he was building the Mishkan. Moshe told him to build the kelim before he built the structure of the Mishkan. And Bezalel says, how can you have a home how can you have the kelim without first building the walls and the roof? And then you put the kelim in. So in order to have the kelim, you first need to build the walls and the roof. And the walls and the roof are finding out what the bread looks like. So that, although it's not the ikar of the Lechem Hapanim, it was like the foundation. That in order to establish the walls and the roof, you have to first establish the foundation, and then you can understand the ikar.
So the next sefer maybe will be on the shulchan after you did the one on the Lechem Hapanim. Okay, so there's a couple more things before we should also get into the second part of the sefer. The chelik aleph and the chelik beis, where you talk about the nisim and beis garmu, malchus, oisha parnasa, Yitzhahara. There's a bunch of stuff. So let's first finish up the first part, working kind of backwards. I realized we forgot. You talk about the ingredients and the baking. You talk about the lisha, the kneading. Talk about that and the ingredients a little bit before we move on to the next part.
Okay, so the ingredients are pretty simple. It's a matzah. When you make a matzah, there's not much room for diversity. You have the flour, you have the water, and in fact, the only ingredient that's mentioned in the psukim is the flour, is the solet. Doesn't mention anything else except the solet. In other words, meikar adin, the only thing that you mechuyab in the Lechem Hapanim is you have each loaf has to have 2 esronim of solet. That is the halacha l'maaseh that you have to have. Anything beyond that is not ikar hadin. So there's room for interpretation of what other ingredients there were. And obviously, the Torah doesn't discuss mundane details. It discusses only details that were relevant because they have a musar haskel ruchani. So obviously, the water and all the other ingredients in the Lechem Hapanim were necessary to make the actual bread, but they didn't have a musar haskel, and therefore the pasuk didn't talk about them. In order to make bread, you obviously need water. You can't just take flour and put flour together without water, mixing it together with water. The pasuk doesn't talk about water because in terms of the water, it's something which is mundane, it's taken for granted, that unless you have water, you cannot make bread. So when you talk about ingredients, they're pretty simple ingredients. You're talking about solet, which is semolina flour in English. You're talking about water. You're talking perhaps about salt, although salt is not mentioned directly in the pasuk. It's mentioned indirectly in the tzivui in Parshat Vayikra. It says, "V'chol korban minchatcha b'melach timlach." Talks about salting all the menachot. It says, "V'chol korban minchatcha b'melach timlach." All the menachot were salted. However, the only salting that we know for sure happened was the menachot that went on the mizbeach. Before the comets of the mincha went on the mizbeach, they did melicha on the kevesh of the mizbeach. The Lechem Hapanim never went on the mizbeach. It was eaten by the kohanim in its entirety. So if the pasuk says v'chol korban minchatcha b'melach timlach, it seems to be a stira, because the Lechem Hapanim never went on the mizbeach. Then it must have also had salt. It says v'chol korban minchatcha. It's one of the menachos. So from that you draw the conclusion that perhaps the Lechem Hapanim also had salt. So you're talking about water, salt, and the solet, the flours, 3 simple ingredients. However, if you bake them only with those 3 ingredients, the end result of the Lechem Hapanim comes up to 1 finger thick. In fact, the Kesef Mishnah in his Perush, he said it's only even 6 miniot etzba, even less than 1 etzba. And how do you get from that to a tefach? In order to get to a tefach, You have to add something else to the bread, some other ingredient or some other technique to get to the thickness of the tefach. So obviously, they didn't add any other ingredient like cinnamon or a spice or even salt to fill up the volume that was needed to get up to a tefach, because it is 65% of the volume compared to 35%, which are the ingredients of the flour and the water. If you add an ingredient which is 65% of the bread, like more salt or more spice or something, that will make the bread inedible. If you add salt in that quantity and ratio to the bread, it makes it into something that is totally inedible. So obviously they have an ingredient which was added to the bread that didn't make it inedible. And obviously that ingredient was air. They inflated the bread with air. And in fact, the Gemara states that b'mforash, it says on Daf Tzadi Dalet Amud Aleph, that the bread after it was baked, it says nafchale. It means that it expanded when it was baking. In other words, in order to get to the thickness of a tefach, it had to expand. So it has to be filled with air. So how do you fill the bread with air? And that began the whole adventure of trying to fill bread with air using different techniques of different chemicals like baking soda, using different techniques of adding extra water to make the bread softer, to make it puff up a little bit higher. But all these techniques fell short. It didn't get close to being a tefach. And we eventually got to this solution that we got to, which was a halachic issue of how to not make the bread chametz and let it come up to the thickness of a tefach. And that is a complicated sugya. I don't want to get into it too complicated now and give away the secret of the book. It's got to leave don't want to give too many spoilers.
Yeah, and there's other things in the Sefer we're not going through, but we won't go through the B'sicha Levina, the shape of the Shulchan. You do discuss the Shulchan in here. The Matbeya Pruta, you discuss as well, of Matisyo and Antigonus, the second one. So there's other things in here that we're not going to mentioning the chapters, and even the ones that we mentioned, which is the corners and the baking and the thickness and the shape. There's a lot more in here. It's a really comprehensive Sefer. We're really scratching the surface. So that's really part one. Part two, as I mentioned, is we already mentioned Beis Garmu, so I don't know how much more there's more, but you can see in the Sefer we did discuss them. But there's the Nisim of the Lechem Hapanim. If you want to talk about more Malchus Oisher Parnasa, you talk about Ezer Asher Smech Bechelka. How does that come in? Shleimus Beshlita Ye B'Yetzahara. Overcoming, having power over the Yetzer Hara. So those are things associated with Lechem Hapanim. And as you stated, Lechem Hapanim is not merely, although you're the baker and you're baking the bread and you're doing experiments with Lechem Hapanim, it would be a mistake to think of Lechem Hapanim as a loaf of bread, because that's not what the Lechem Hapanim was. It wasn't just simply a cool, fancy loaf of bread. So I'll let you talk a little bit more about this second part of the Sefer.
Okay, so we talked about Beis Garmu, that the fact that they managed to succeed and they were zoche to siyata dishmaya is because they understood the pnimiut of the Lechem Hapanim. They understood that it wasn't simply a bread that was for eating. It had obviously a huge, enormous depth of ruchaniut. And that was where they succeeded, that they got the siyata dishmaya. So in order for the Lechem Hapanim to be able to perform this function of bringing the Shefa HaElyon down to the Olam HaGashmi, you need a dimension of ruchaniut which allows this to happen. And that is basically the second part of the book, is trying to decipher some of the structure of the pnimiut of the Lechem Hapanim. When the Rambam talks about the Lechem Hapanim I think it's in Moreh Nevuchim, he said that he tried to understand it, but it's beyond him. He doesn't understand the purpose of the Lechem Hapanim, which is very difficult. I mean, the Rambam is Oker Harim, and that he doesn't understand what the purpose of the Lechem Hapanim. So, katonti to say exactly what the purpose of the Lechem Hapanim is. The Rambam didn't understand it. But b'chol zot, a lot of other mefarshim do try to delve into the ruchnius of the Lechem Hapanim. So I didn't sort of invent the wheel trying to delve into this aspect of the Lechem Hapanim. I tried to bring as much of the other perushim as I possibly could. And the most common approach to understanding the pnimius of the Lechem Hapanim is from Torah Hasod. It's not really pshat. It's more understanding more Ramazim and Torah Hasod from the Zohar, And there's a lot of deep, deep stuff in there which connect to the Esesfirot and trying to understand the structure of the Shefa HaElyon and how it relates to our handling of the Shefa HaElyon in our world, in the Olam HaGashmi, how we relate to Parnosa, how we deal with Parnosa. And all of this is inside the Lechem Hapanim. That every single facet of the Lechem Hapanim has some ramification to how we deal with Parnosa. Just for a small example, the gematria of Menakiyot is the same gematria as Ribit. In other words, the Menakiyot, the word Menakiyot means something which cleans something from the Lashon of Naki. So the fact that it has a gematria of Ribit means that in order to be Naki in your business dealings, you're not allowed to deal with Ribit. There's a remez there already that the Lechem Hapanim is teaching us how to work in the business world, how to deal honestly. There's also the inyan of efa ve'efa, tzedek, efa tzedek ve'hin tzedek, that the dimensions of Lechem Hapanim, that the length and the breadth were solid whole numbers, they were integral numbers. You had the dimension of the shulchan, not the Lechem Hapanim. It was amatayim or ko amar ochbo. They are integral numbers, but the height of the Lechem Hapanim of the shulchan was ama v'chetzi komato. It's a half, it's a fractional dimension. The question is why the length and the breadth are integral and the height is fractional. So I give a proposed answer to them in the Sefer that the dimensions refer to the tzedek tirdof, that the dimensions, the length and the breadth refer to the different dimensions of tzedek tirdof, that you have to be honest in your business dealings, but that the height of the shulchan is referring to accumulating wealth, how high your pile of gold is. And that should be fractional. Whatever it is, it doesn't have to be whole. You should still be samech b'chelkacha. So there's a lot of pnimiut in the Lechem Hapanim that relates specifically to Parnosa. Also relates to what is Parnosa, what is the concept of Osher, what is a person who is Ashir? Does it only relate to money or does it have other implications, Parnosa? So in the Sefer, I talk about that being Ashir is not only being materially wealthy in terms of Kesef, it's also relating to children having offspring and having offspring following the derech of the Torah. It's also related to Geshem, the Gvorot Geshamim, how the Parnos of the world begins and ends through the process of Geshem that is translated into food, which is translated into wealth. This is all discussed in the chapter on Osher and Parnasah. The following chapter was relating to the Musar HaSkel of the Shekel of the Lechem Hapanim, how it relates to Simcha and Ivdu et Hashem b'Simcha, and the importance of smiling. And in that chapter, I go through the whole explanation of how the concept of smiling appears in the Perushim. For example, the Sipur of Tanur Achnai, or the Sugya of Tanur Achnai in the Gemara, when Rabbi Yoshua and the Chachamim ruled against Rabbi Eliezer ben Hukranus, who brought all kinds of proofs why his proof was the correct proof, that the Charuv would move and the Amat Maim would flow backwards and the walls of the Beis HaMidrash would tilt inwards. And even a bat kol came down saying that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer ben Hukranus. But then Rabbi Yoshua got up on his hind feet and he says, sorry, do not interfere. Lo b'shamayim there's a concept of that the majority opinion goes, and the Chachamim rule the majority, and that's a halacha. And the end of the Gemara says that after that, one of the Chachamim met up with Eliyahu Hanavi, and he asked him, he said, when this diyun was going on between the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer, what was HaKadosh Baruch Hu doing when he heard what the maskana of the Gemara was? And the Gemara says that he was smiling. So there we get a source that HaKadosh Baruch Hu smiles. And this is connected also to Birkas Kohanim, where it says, Ya'er Hashem panav elecha, that Hashem lightens his face, all connected with smiling. And that's basically the reason that I decided to call the name of the book, Me'ir Panim, because it is all connected to the concept of smiling. And the final chapter, obviously, is the chapter of the Yetzer Hara. I've always been searching for something equivalent to Stephen Hawking's theory of everything. I don't know if you heard of Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist, but he's been searching his whole life for a theory that will explain everything, some theory that ties all the different theories together into one integral unit. And for me, the last chapter of the book was that kind of a concept. It was kind of a theory of everything. It is the origin of bread in the world, basically. And it all started with the Eitz Hadat. And I go through the chapter proposing that the Eitz Hadat was according to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, that it was chita, that it was wheat, and that the sin of the Eitz Hadat was based on bread. So therefore, the Lechem Hapanim is a kapara for the Eitz Hadat, according to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. And that is basically the whole of the last chapter, talking about the connection between controlling the Yetzer Hara and the different components of the Shulchan, why they are as they are. For example, the Miskeret. The Miskeret is a kind of something that limits the Yetzer Hara. So why is the Miskeret? If it's on top of the Shulchan or underneath the Shulchan, and all this is tied into the concept of controlling the Yetzer Hara.
So, as you explained, there's much more to the Sefer than just actual Lechem Hapanim and baking and things like that. Then you have appendices, a number of them as well, which is you explain how the maximum thickness obtainable after baking the showbread using specified ingredients from biblical and Mishnaic sources. That's the first one, and you call it Lechem Hapanim, the Showbread. I should explain the Showbread Institute. We'll talk more about that. Then you talk about when you baking soda and some sort of acid, and you go through. You explain different shiurim, different types of flour. I mean, these are kind of the appendices are a bunch of practical kind of experiments. And then you explain more about Rashi, drawing the Lechem Hapanim. You go through the manuscripts. You go through here as well the story that you relayed. So some of that is in the Sefer, and then some is here in the back in the appendix. And you go through different Gemaras, different editions, different manuscripts of Rashi. You talk about the Rambam. The Rambam Shita is another one as well, another appendix. And then there's a few other. There's one more appendix as well. So if you want to mention the appendices before we kind of finish up.
Okay, so the appendices are basically the technicalities. All the experimentation that we did was done under scientific regimen. It was all done in a lab. In our bakery, we do it all according to scientific procedures, measuring things and documenting and according to scientific protocol. So what you see in the back of the book is the accepted format for presenting a scientific experiment. That's why it's written in that format. A lot of it is in English because we want to eventually submit these experiments to different journals which talk about cereal chemistry, because they have certain implications on other issues. For example, one of the experiments that we did in order to determine when a bread becomes chametz in terms of the chemistry of the bread, and we did different experiments based on the Gisha of Moshe Feinstein, Zichrono Livracha, how he defines the process of chimutz, that he defines it as a change in the taste of the bread. So we use that yardstick to try to determine the point, at which point exactly the bread becomes chametz. And that was one of the experiments that we did. And what we discovered from this experiment was something that was totally unexpected, is that in addition to the bread becoming sour, tasting sour when it becomes chametz after a certain specific time, which is quite funny, that it's actually about after 15 minutes. So when they talk about 18 minutes of becoming chametz in the Gemara, they're pretty spot on with the timing that is corroborated by scientific experimentation, modern scientific experimentation. What was interesting is that when the bread developed a sourness, that was the yardstick to determine that it had become chametz, it also developed a slight sweetness. There was an added sweetness to the bread. It was a noticeable sweetness that it was added when it became chametz. It was very slight. It wasn't very pronounced, but that was definitely noticeable. And that could be very well another marker to determine when the bread becomes chametz, that it acquires this added sweetness. And maybe that is why the isur of seor and dvash are not allowed on the mizbeach, because there is a connection between chametz and sweetness in the bread. They're connected chemically. So all the appendices at the back of the book are basically the experiments. It's a very small handful of the thousands and thousands of experiments that we did in the Machon Lechem Hapanim, baking the bread with endless variations of different ratios of flour to water and different baking temperatures and different kelim, thousands and thousands of hours of experimentation in the lab. And that was just a small handful of the more prominent ones. Behind these, there are many sub-experiments which are expressed in these main experiments. So that's basically the end of the book. The final part of the book is the shut for the premise of how we expanded the bread to the thickness of a tefach without making it chametz. It's a very complicated halachic sugya, which we did in collaboration with Rav Shabtai Rappaport from the Machon HaGavoa LeTorah VaHalacha. And that basically wraps up the book. We've already started working on the second edition of the book, by the way. Bezrat Hashem, it's going to come out around Sukkot time, Bli Neder. And there's a lot more chidushim in the book about all different things, a lot more clarifications of some things that weren't spelled out clearly enough. We tried to clarify things. We made the format a little bit more readable. We also added a gallery of pictures in the back of the book of actual photos of some of the experiments with the actual kelim that we used and how the bread actually looks in reality when it's baked, not just pictures, schematic drawings.
So if this podcast comes out after Sukkot, which I'm not sure, after Sukkot 2023, then you'll know that that's the edition.
You'll be buying the second edition already.
Correct. So regardless, there's going to be a link in the show's notes where you can purchase the Sefer, and hopefully it's going to be available for sale in America, but there's a link I'll put in there. I'll also link to your website. I want to just ask also for the listeners, are there presentations? Are these presentations online? Do you have to be in Eretz Yisrael in person? And if it's only in Eretz Yisrael, how can people act? How can they, if they're interested in these presentations?
Okay, so we have a very bare bones YouTube channel, which is called the Showbread Institute. If you go to YouTube, you can search for the Showbread Institute on YouTube. And we have a number of videos there, some in English, some in Hebrew, but it needs a lot of work. We still have a lot of work to do. We need to expand that quite a lot. It's a matter of resources, trying to balance the parnasa with the passion. And eventually, Bezrat Hashem will embellish those a little bit more. We also do workshops here in Israel. When you want to actually see the bread with your own eyes, we actually have hands-on workshops that we actually take around the country. We have a portable oven and a portable model of the shulchan, and we go to schools and yeshivas and ulpanas and batei knesset, and we have it's a two-hour workshop where we actually bake the Lechem Hapanim. That's one of the workshops we do. We do other workshops baking the other menachot, the Shtei HaLechem, the Korban Todah. We have a whole bunch of hands-on workshops besides a bunch of lectures, which I give. We can do the lectures either in person or we can do them online via Zoom, depending on the proximity of the audience to the speaker.
Okay, so that's great. So I'll put information. I'll link to the website in the show's notes. I'll put in the YouTube channel, and I guess I'll link to the Sefer that people can find out that way. One more thing, I did realize we forgot. You have a number of haskamas to the Sefer. I don't know if you wanted to mention that here in closing.
Yes. Okay. So Baruch Hashem, we managed to get quite a number of haskamas from prominent rabbonim. It was very important that I got haskamas from the experts who deal specifically with this tchum, because most of the rabbonim don't have expertise specifically in the kodshim and the Lechem Hapanim. So it was important to me to get the haskama of the head of the Machon HaMikdash, Rav Israel Ariel, who is the leading expert in anything to do with the Beis HaMikdash. His Machon HaMikdash is very well known worldwide, and it was very important to get his haskama. It was important also to get the haskama of Professor Amar from Bar Ilan, who was my mentor and my co-collaborator on most of the research. He was the groundbreaking pioneer in the terms of the Lechem Hapanim research. He got the whole ball rolling. After 2,000 years of not knowing how the Lechem Hapanim was baked, he was the first guy basically who really tried to do it again. And I got into the whole thing because of him. So it was very important to get his Haskoma. And I'm trying to get extra Haskomas for the second edition of the Sefer, Bezrat Hashem, to expand it to more audiences, different circles, and try and get different Haskomas from different circles.
Okay, terrific. And, I didn't go through it super in-depth, but I did definitely skim through and flip through it. And it's very interesting, very in-depth. It's a topic I didn't know a ton about. And I think we're all familiar somewhat, a little bit from Chumash, what we know, what we heard of in the Gemara maybe. But you go through this, you really go through this. So as you said, it's, the first of, I'm not sure of any others, but the Sefer that goes through the sugya really in depth, all the different aspects of it. And it's very informative, and it seems like a very good job. So thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for coming on to explain, and hopefully listeners enjoyed it. And again, if they really want to check out more besides the presentations, purchase the Sefer as well. It's, very informative, very interesting. So thank you again.